Good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Sherman, Digital Curation Librarian here at Drexel University Libraries and co-chair of the Scholarly Communications Working Group. Welcome to our second Open Access Week talk of 2023, hosted by, of course, Drexel University Libraries. Open Access Week is a global event promoting access to knowledge, highlighting open activities, and promoting actions that will make more scholarly and educational materials freely available to teachers, learners, researchers, and the public. Today, we have Dr. Michael Bruneau to speak to us. Dr. Bruneau is an associate teaching professor of health sciences in the College of Nursing and Health Professions with a joint appointment in the Department of Nutrition Sciences at Drexel University. He's the director of the Clinical Exercise Physiology Laboratory, Exercise Science and Health Sciences undergraduate research programs, and immediate past president for the MARC ACSM. He has and continues to provide service to the College of Nursing and Health Professions Implementation Science Research Interest Group and Department of Health Sciences Leadership Education Advising and Development Peer Mentoring Program. Dr. Bruneau's presentation today is entitled Open Access Publishing in Exercise Science Research, Weighing the Pros and Cons. Dr. Bruneau will speak to us for about 50 to 60 minutes, followed by a few minutes for questions. If you're joining us online, please enter your questions in the chat, or if you wish to do so privately, send them through a private chat to Stacy Stanislaw, who will then ask them later at the end. Without further introduction, Dr. Bruneau.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right, so I might wander a little bit, but that's okay because I got to get the energy out. But it's such an honor and privilege to be able to speak with everybody here this week. Janice, it's great to see you as always. And I was telling folks in the room that really I have a lot of respect and I really understand the value that the Drexel Libraries offers to the university. And so when asked to give this talk, it was a natural yes for me. What we're going to talk a little bit about today, hopefully the title is not too cliche about weighing the evidence with weightlifting and those types of things. But really what I like to do the first minute or so of a lot of my talks is just do a little bit of culture building and let folks know who I am and how sort of I got into this field to at least have some level of knowledge to talk to you about open access here today. So I came to Drexel University in 2016, but much of my academic research and experience and training, both on the academic side as well as in the corporate fitness, healthcare, and professional service side of things, was mostly in New England, as you can see, right? So I did undergrad at CCSU, did a graduate degree in exercise science at UConn, and then did my PhD at Springfield. And all along the way, one of the things I always tell my students is, it's great to have an academic degree, but it's even better if you have an academic degree plus experience, right? Because you think about if you come in, and even if you're working a part-time job or doing something even 10 hours a week, you're working on gaining skill sets, knowing how to interact with people. And so it was very important to me throughout my academic journey to always be working and doing something productive in the field where I can apply what I was learning in the real world. And so I spent some time at Bally's and then worked as a cardiac rehab tech at Hartford Healthcare. And then when I went to Springfield, needed some funds to help support the grad education. So took a night job in outpatient observation on a cardiac telemetry unit. So that's how I got to Philadelphia. But I really think, this is a call out to one of my colleagues and fellow CCSU and Springfield alum, Dr. Steve Vitti, who I believe is joining us online. Steve, thanks for being here today. But really to kind of give everybody a sense for what is the field of exercise science, right? At the beginning of the field, a lot of people thought that exercise science was like somebody that knew something that was scientifically germane to a gym teacher or a physical education teacher, right? And that, most of the people in the field were these sort of large bodybuilding types that would walk around the gym and give recommendation in terms of sets, reps, and weight, and just do it because it works for me. But really what exercise science is, and we have a a program, an undergrad exercise science program now in the health sciences building. It's really about the study of how the human organism responds to the immediate effects of exercise, biologically, chemically, hormonally, and how, when exposed to those bouts over repeated periods of time, translates into chronic adaptations that can either be beneficial for health, well-being, and athletic performance. So here's an example of one of our foreign exchange students. 2 of them came through, had a really good experience with them. Both students were from Barcelona, and really they learned and had the ability to apply some of the content knowledge in the realm of biology, chemistry, physics, and really exploring how to apply and translate those concepts with energy systems into a real world application. So here you have Angela on the bike. Luke is sitting there. He looks pretty interested. And Luke is a very, very great kid. And he is sitting there counting the reps. It's a very important job. So as Angela pedals that bike, he's counting the number of revolutions that she is able to exert over the weighted stack. Those silver sort of chrome plated things are 7.5% of Angela's body weight that she has to overcome on this bike. And so really it tests the energy systems. So just to give you an overview of what exercise science is, I think is an important realm for that. Okay, so now let's transition and talk a little bit about my experience and my first opportunity when it came to publication consideration, and where open access provided a venue for me to get information that I worked on scholastically into the field. And the first thing that I think is really important for any students or folks in the room that have ever published or had to work with members of a journal editor board is failure. So this is an email that I received from Dr. Steve Roth. Now, ironically, Steve Roth was a leading expert in the field of exercise genomics. So trying to identify responders and non-responders to exercise, like why does it work well for some people but not other people? Do your genes play a role in that? And at the time, I was just finishing up at the University of Connecticut with my master's degree, and I was really excited. You know, I was thinking about doing a PhD at the University of Maryland, working with Dr. Roth. So I thought, like, for sure, he's going to give me an opportunity to publish my paper. And sadly, he was informing me and my colleagues that the paper was going to be rejected. So Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise is kind of the flagship journal in the field of the American College of Sports Medicine. And a lot of people in the field try to get published in that journal. It's a subscription-based journal, so non-open access fee at this point in time. So then, you know, like my mentor and at the time, confidant, still have a good relationship with her, Linda Pescatello, tried to exert her dominance in the field to try and see if Steve would be willing to give my paper another read, because the comments appeared to be pretty addressable. And Steve, you know, something that I didn't understand at the time, but definitely understand now, is he did the right thing, right? He was not going to overrule the people that are dedicating their time and attention to reviewing the science, and he honored their decision to reject the manuscript. And so while I really wanted to get this paper published in Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise, and people advocated for me, I needed to seek another venue. The good news is that we did publish it in 2015 through the Journal of Science and Medicine and Sport. And at the time, this was a really important new journal. A lot of people weren't really publishing in the space, but they had open access charges. And fortunately, Dr. Pescatello was able to help cover the cost for those as a broke college student. And we got the paper published in Journal of Science, Medicine, and Sport. And as you can see, the title was The Blood Pressure Response to Acute and Chronic Aerobic Exercise, where we meta-analyzed all the literature in the field about candidate gene association studies and identifying responders versus non-responders. Ironically, what ended up coming of this is every year or every other year, Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise publishes a review of all the top science in the field of exercise genomics in Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise. And in 2016, a colleague of mine from the University of South Carolina, his name is Mark Sarzinski, he was writing the paper at this time. And this paper was the most highly cited paper in the field of exercise genomics. So it's kind of ironic that on one hand, I couldn't get it published in the journal I wanted to, but like a year later, it's being cited as one of the most highly cited works in the field. So open access, I think, provided me with an opportunity to get this really important work out there in journals that were more traditionally subscription-based, recognize that, which is great to see. So if you take a look, a couple things, just not sure who the audience would be joining us, but folks who are first exploring how to go about really identifying where's a good fit for my science, regardless if it's from a more traditional subscription-based service or if it's through open access, is everybody should be using the library resources and using the Web of Knowledge journal citation label. This is a really good tool that we used in our science of that systematic review and meta-analysis study to identify whether higher quality studies were being published in more higher impact journals. So understanding sort of the nuances, it's not just a matter of how many pubs versus how many citations. It was really trying to get a sense for, do the effect sizes of our study yield stronger or weaker findings depending upon if they're published in a journal with a higher versus lower impact factor. So this is actually considered as part of the analytic plan. If you type in the word exercise, I did this the other day, you get 24 journals that come up with the keyword of exercise. But exercise science has a number of ancillary terms that can be accounted for with it. So physical activity and exercise and cycling and treadmill walking and gerontology and biomechanics and clinical exercise physiology, on and on and on and on and on. So although when you search, it appears there's only 24 journals, when you really start to pivot and loosen up the words that can mean the same thing or infers an engagement in exercise, you get way more articles. So this is the first good place to look. Usually when someone wants to publish a paper and they're not really sure and someone asks me, I kind of look at the science now first and then go to journal citation report and see what journals might be a good fit based off of a number of things, right? Getting the work in something that is higher in impact factor if we can, how competitive is it to get into the space, et cetera. But I think it's helpful to know that. In the realm of exercise science research, however, is as of, I believe, Saturday or Sunday, there was like 600,000 results, 577,000 total results that came up from the keyword exercise. Again, this is not inclusive of all possible terms that I mentioned. But there's already like 20 articles that are already pre-published for 2024. And the first paper that was published in exercise science research was actually done way to the left of this negatively skewed distribution, was in 1806. And in 2023, 28,000 studies in the field have been published. So this is a very, very highly sought after area where people are interested in the use of lifestyle and how sort of the sweet science of exercise prescription can improve health and well-being. So now that you kind of have an understanding about really what exercise science is and the scope, I think it's helpful to now talk a little bit about some of the accessibility. And one of the things that I'm learning right now in the LeBeau MBA program is that when it comes to awareness and access of things, there's awareness for your science and there's accessibility to the science, right? So how well known is your work in the field and how readily available and accessible is that work in the real world? So of course, as we can see here, there's a little bit of glare on the screen, but it looks okay in the slide here, is accessibility is a really important thing because you might have awareness, but if there are gatekeepers and if there are sort of all these barriers to gain access to the work, you're sort of slowing the progression of science. And so open access provides a forum where everybody can gain access to that scientific work, which improves people in real time, right? How many people, just by a show of hands in the room, and people online behind your screens, you can raise your hand too. How many people have ever heard of the word implementation science, right? Dissemination science, implementation science, right? So implementation science is all about the science of what causes the systematic uptake of information, right? So if you publish a paper and it's not actually used in the real world, how many years on average do you think it takes to get that into real world practice. So let's take something in the field of exercise science and sports medicine. Something gets published in 2023. How many years down the line before people are routinely establishing it as part of their routine care? What do you think?
5 years.
5 years, Janice thinks? 5? 17 on average. So information that was published in like 2006 to 2008 is just now being put into certification exams and is really part of how we practice care. And I learned a lot about that by participating in Laura Gitlin's implementation fall science research institute. When I really started to understand is like, it's important to have awareness, but if it's not accessible, you're delaying the systematic uptake of that research into real world settings. The other thing, of course, is building a brand and having visibility of your work. And so a good thing that I think open access really does is it increases the visibility of your work to a wider range of audience, particularly when you think about social media, that anybody that has access to an open access article can put that on their Twitter, pending the copyright restrictions, of course, and what the author has agreed to through the publication process. But you know, a colleague of mine who gave a keynote lecture a few weeks back is Dr. Nicole Keith from the University of Indiana, Purdue, Indianapolis, IUPUI. And one of the things that she was talking about in the realm of her career was how to become visible and how to create room when there is no space, right? So when you think about in the field of exercise science back in the 1980s, 1990s, you would have people from these academic research institutions, and pretty much it was a rich get richer type of a thing where the master's, the PhD students publish under the mentor, and then the legacy of the mentor continues on. But how does someone who's not from that background get access into the space and make a name for themselves? And one of the ways that you do that now, I think, is with open access, because you can now publish your work. You can pay, even in subscription journals, the open access fee to make it accessible. And you can really start building a brand of your science that gets out there, right? Like, for example, I had an open access publication that I gave this year. And I was at that same conference where Nicole Keith was giving this talk about how to create space when there's no room. And I was asked as an invited speaker, right? Like that might not have happened if the article wasn't as readily available and shared, and the journal was sharing it on platforms like LinkedIn and tagging me with my whole network. So people that were important in the exercise science community wanted to learn about that work. I might not have gotten an invited talk to do something in that area. So I think it's important for increasing visibility. Of course, we also understand that the time course of what it takes to get the article from its drafted state into press is significantly shortened, right? So a lot of times, you know, to this day, I'll still tell you that the guidelines for authors is a necessary thing, but it is a painstaking thing for science, for us scientists, because if something doesn't get accepted, you got to completely redo the whole thing, and that could take 2 or 3 days to just constantly change it from the requirements of one journal to the requirements of another journal. So rapid dissemination and getting your work out there soon is an additional advantage that I view as helpful for open access. And then thinking about opportunities for collaboration. So because it's more accessible and people around the globe, some folks that have more resources, but having even fewer resources, open access provides an avenue where anybody with internet access can gain access to reading your science. And so this created a nice opportunity for me in 2020. So this is the journal Nutrients, which applies open access charges. And at the time, right prior to the pandemic, my colleague, Dr. Jen Nasser from the Department of Nutrition Sciences, was telling me about some of her work. And so a lot of Dr. Nasser's work is using nutrition as a tool to curb eating behavior, right? So like eating a higher she had this famous study that was on campus called the ice cream study. And it was all about if you give a high load protein preload prior to ad libitum ice cream intake, you'll typically eat less than if you have a high sugar, low protein. So protein seems to be really important in terms of curbing appetite, even the desire to eat. But this journal Nutrients was in the game of coming out with a special issue in an area that I do a lot of research in, which is the effects of exercise on appetite suppression, both curbing the hunger hormones and adjusting the peptide hormones for satiety. And so Dr. Nasser was like, hey, I'm going to the UK. Unfortunately, she had to cancel that trip because of COVID. But I remember having dinner with her, and I had just gotten asked to do this. And she's like, I'm going to the UK, and I'm going to be meeting with this gentleman named David Bruneau. And I'm like, wait a minute, I know David Bruneau. He's over at Coventry University. He works with John Blundell and his team. And the reason I knew that is because David Bruneau published his master's thesis and dissertation creating a scale of appetite and how hungry you are after an exercise bout. I'm like, I've referred to his work in my own work. And so it was sort of a serendipitous way of being introduced to David. But then I got connected to David, and we formed an international collaboration between the three of us to come up with what was called the PAC-19 survey. At the time, there was a lot of uncertainty in terms of the lockdowns and how physically active people were and how that was impacting health. And so this sort of provided an opportunity for us to do that. The reason why I bring up Nutrients is because Nutrients is an open access publication predominantly, and David and Jennifer both submitted journals for that special issue. And so it showed that having access to our work really provided an avenue for open collaboration. Okay, additional things that I think open access does that helps to improve transparency, and there are a number of funding models and way to pay for it. So some people are now getting included in their startup package monies on how they can include costs for paying for open access publication fees. So historically, this was quite burdensome if the department didn't have the funds, and thank goodness for the Drexel Libraries for pilot testing the open access program. Jennifer and I actually took advantage of that program for the Nutrients article. I was a co-author helping her with that paper. So it was a way where we were tight on money, right? Academic institutions are tight for finances these days. And it looks like it might be that way for the future. So having alternative ways of paying for the open access charges is nice. And they generally range. You know, in the field of exercise science, you can have an open access charge as little as like $300, and you can have open access charges that are like $2,500 to $3,000. And so it's highly variable in our field in terms of, I'm not sure if that's consistent with what everybody's seeing across a range of disciplines, but you can have one journal where it's like $300, one-time fee, as many pages as you want. And in other cases, it's like, no, it's $150 a page times X number of pages. So it creates a little bit of complexity in terms of how we're going to pay for things. And this really comes back to, like, I have this thing that I talk about with support, right? And everybody wants to know about, like, what is a supportive environment, right? What is a supportive environment? And, a supportive environment could be, I'm having a bad day and I'm going to complain, and you're going to listen to me, and you're going to say, yeah, I know, don't worry, just keep at it. That's support. That's one type of support. But then having academic support or built-in structures for figuring out how we're going to pay for these fees, if you don't have a grant, and some grants actually have requirements and how much you can apply towards publication fees, et cetera. There are a range of ways to pay for things. You have to get creative. So on one hand, it could be a con that if there's no support or structure to pay for it, the faculty member might be pulling out their own wallet to get their science into circulation. But the good news is that in most circumstances, there are little pockets. I've learned this. There's always little pockets of money somewhere that's not being used, and there's generally ways of finding it. So, even going to conferences sometimes, if you have to put monies out, and it's like, well, the amount of monies that I can get covered for are more than, and usually by the end of the year, there's always like some money somewhere, it just shows up where people can do that. So another thing to think about is, of course, quality control. And this is definitely not the case from my experience in exercise science research, but you've got some of these journals, like Nutrients, is considered to be an open access predominant journal, but has very, very good quality science in it, very, very strong impact factors. And so what's nice about it is when it comes to quality, you can get the same level of peer review of your work as you would in a traditional subscription-based programming. And I'll talk a little bit about peer review as we move forward. But licensing also comes to mind, right? So it's either, there's sort of a spectrum of it's closed, completely inaccessible unless you're part of a subscription, or you got to pay by the journal. I remember when I was a master's student, Dr. Pescatella, who I brought back, advocated for me with that paper. We didn't get published. But yeah, she's like, oh, can you go find this article for me? And, work at the time, it was my colleague, Jill Livingston at UConn. She was the information scientist. And I was like getting ready to like pull out my wallet to like pay the $35 for the paper. And I'm like, should I just like pay for this paper for Dr. Pescatello? And she's like, you never pay for the paper, never pay. We have interlibrary loans. And I'm glad that I made that email because, as a unbeknownst first year master's student, I wanted to make a good impression with my advisor, and she wanted the article and it said I couldn't have access to it. So, but open access has a range of criteria from completely closed to completely open. Public people can share it and they don't need to reference, or they can keep it open and they have to give recognition to where the original source material was. So, for example, if somebody is highlighting a review and there's a critical point in the review that has an original research study, that research study needs to be referenced as well as to the reviewer who took the time to synthesize the information. So licensing comes to mind as something else that we have to think about. And I talked about this a little bit before, but there are cost considerations, right? And a con would really be that what happens if there isn't, there's just no money to pay for it, is this could often fall back on the faculty member themselves. So when I was a PhD student, one of the things that happened was, I'm trying to finish up my PhD. I'm trying to get some early papers published to get into the field. And I remember I couldn't afford an open access charge for one of the journals I was working on with my PhD advisors. And I remember, support, I remember my mother taking out a line of a credit card and paying for the open access charge. And eventually the school, like I said, the school found little pockets of money and ended up reimbursing us. But support comes in a lot of different ways. And I was fortunate to have that option, that she was willing to do that for me, so that way I could pursue my dreams. So, but cost considerations are definitely something to think about. And I think it's important that we start to think about long-term, how we're going to pay for things without tuition dollars and without grant funding. And one thing that comes to mind would be organizing these types of events, right? Where maybe we have a conference and the money that supports an open access conference's revenues generated could be used to support that pocket of money that the university can offer faculty members in a pool where there's an application process and so forth. Not that it has to happen. I'm just thinking we got to get more creative in completely relying on student tuition dollars to fund it, right? Or our grant monies to fund it, or our department chair to find pockets of money to fund it. Because at the end of the day, if you really want your science to come out, it's going to fall on you in order to do it. Okay. Another thing that I'm sure folks are aware of at this point in time is there's, in the field of exercise science, this was not something that was really expected until about 2021-ish. I remember publishing a paper with my colleague, Brandy Jo Malayern, in the journal called The Prostate. It was about physical activity and prostate cancer risk. And it was really in that clinical journal where the expectation was, in addition to the peer-reviewed publication, we would like you to submit the actual full data file, right? And at first, the culture, especially in our field, I'll talk about an example, but the culture is what do you want to know that for, right? It was what do you want my data for, right? Because I think people were worried that people were going to go snooping and find that maybe corners were cut and, that hurts their reputation. And one of the papers that we published about methodological quality, I'll talk about. But open data is now something that we're starting to see more of. It's not definitely transparent across the board in all exercise science journals at this point, but you see the change agents, people from places like the American Cancer Society and the American Heart Association, these major organizations in health are requiring them as part of their publications. And so it hasn't fully trickled all the way down in the exercise journals yet, but it's something that we're starting to see and be adopted in the field. Okay. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about what the peer review process looks like with traditional subscription-based journals, and open access journals in the field of exercise science and sports medicine. But of course, the first thing we think about is peer review is absolutely critical for quality assurance, and it needs to undergo rigorous expert review. And to that aim, this is another paper that we had published with, this is Dr. Blair Johnson from the Center for Health Intervention and Prevention. I think it's called InChip now, up at UConn. And we ran into a situation where we asked for data. So Blair is an expert in the science of systematic review and meta-analysis. He's had experience doing something called a meta-synthesis. Has anybody ever heard of that before? Which is a systematic review and meta-analysis of systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Blair, I mean, I remember spending countless hours in his office, and he started like working with us on my work, which if you recall from many slides back, we were talking about the effects of exercise on candidate genes and responders and non-responders to blood pressure, right? So Blair is not an exercise person, right? He's a social psychologist, and his thing is he knows systematic review and meta-analysis. A lot of his work was in HIV prevention. And so Blair starts going like, something's going on with all these studies. Like he starts looking through the literature with us, and he's like, I kind of feel like the quality of some of these exercise studies with blood pressure are just not done well. And so we were in the process of doing a mega project, which is sort of a pool of studies on different systematic reviews and meta-analyses in the realm of exercise for blood pressure control. And what Blair did is one of the studies was on blood pressure. And he decided to come up with a quality coding rubric based predominantly or originally off of the Downs and Black methodological quality checklist, which is a 27-item checklist where higher scores indicate that studies have better study quality. And many of the meta-analyses that we reviewed were not done well. We found they were cutting corners. It created a little bit of a hairy situation because I got caught in the middle as a student. So I'm not going to name the scientist, but it's not anybody I've worked with. It's someone in the field that some of you may know if I mentioned the name, but it's not relevant to the discussion. But Blair was sort of realizing that a number of suspect systematic reviews and meta-analyses were being published in this domain. And he started like in his quality coding, started realizing like, oh, wait a minute, like this is like, there's only 2 authors on all these meta-analyses, and the 2 happen to be married, and the 2 happen to be the 2 coders for the meta-analyses, and they happen to come to a consensus among the 2, not having a third independent person verify the coding. And so this was something that was coming through in our reporting. The problem is that the person whose work we were criticizing was the peer reviewer of the manuscript. So it took us like a year and a half to get this thing published because we were overly critical of some of that person's work. And to a certain degree, we all have egos, right? And depending on how big or how controlled it is, it took us a while to get this one through. But really thinking about what peer review does is it provides an avenue where the science should really be based off of testing and keeping these studies in check. And so it's a good thing in that way. It also provides a lot of good feedback that can be really productive, particularly for junior faculty members that are really continuing to develop their writing skills and their grantsmanship skills is really important. So getting that feedback, oftentimes reviewer one's feedback is usually like spot on, exactly, very valid criticisms. I don't know, you all know like the memes of reviewer 2 and reviewer 3 that's been out there. I have a couple in here, but so like reviewer 2 stuff is almost like never on point, right? It's like someone that just agreed to review the work, which is a challenge, right? When you're looking for quality feedback from experts in the field, and the person is just like, I really would prefer if you use the word this versus that, or I found a little typo on page 14, which is important feedback, but isn't substantive feedback of the science that the person's supposed to be shielding and making sure is reported in a way where best practices are being used. So there's that. We also have publication guidance, open access journals, just like subscription-based journals, do a really good job of making sure that the guidelines for authors have to be met. In our field, we're seeing a lot of like templates now. So instead of like, you must follow this font at this size and no more than this many characters. In the first stages of the paper's review process, people are writing the manuscript their way and for the science. And once it gets through the peer review stage, then it's expected, not if you want it to be published, now you got to conform. So it's less burdensome to have to constantly get it exactly in the format that the guidelines for authors want. And then 2 days later, the editor says, no, not interested. And then you got to go back, take a week to get it back into the next journal. A lot of the journals in the exercise science field now are accepting journals, your paper to be written in the way that you interpret it. They review the content, and then if it's ready, they feel it's worthy of moving on to the next stage, then those guidelines get tightened up and they have to be met. So it helps to, if something doesn't get turned around, you can integrate your feedback and get it out to another venue very quickly. So again, that dissemination, the rapid acceleration is helpful. It also filters out lower quality work. So peer review does a really good job of that, particularly if there is conflicting hypotheses and the person really understands what's in the data. Okay, really understand what's going in the data. And then sadly, in some of the fields, you find that there are ethical considerations. And the purpose of this talk is not really to talk about ethical considerations per se, but there have been at least 3 people that I haven't known personally, but have heard through the network, people I know that have known a person that, trying to get tenure, trying to get promotion, needs the next funding grant, that they're sort of, I wouldn't call it necessarily data fabrication, but overextending the findings of what the findings actually said definitively, right? Like, this is the cure to cancer versus talking in context of what the findings actually do. So peer review does generally a good job for that. We'll talk a little bit about what I think the open access journals need to be doing better. They are providing like tokens for people to publish their work with discounts from open access fees. But generally there is a big problem and debate about the burden that faculty members and researchers have on their plate to peer review articles for publication consideration for-profit open access journals that are not compensated. So, these journals are, a lot of them, like you think Elsevier, billions of dollars a year they make in all their fees, but they rely on volunteers, which is service, to faculty members, which the university has to count that as service as part of the workload. So everything has a cost. The universities are really picking up the cost of the time and the labor that the faculty members, or it's unpaid labor that these folks have to do in the greater good of their field and the science, which is why a lot of us do it. But you're starting to see in our field, a lot of the journals are starting to recognize people more. But this is something I saw on Twitter. Now it's called X, right? Elon changed the name of the company. But I thought this was really cool. So this is someone, and it was about, thank you for this is a letter that they wrote back to someone who was open access, asking them to review a paper for free, effectively. And the person says, thank you for your invitation to review in Nature Communications. Because Nature is a for-profit publisher, that's a key word there, my consulting fee is $200 per hour. Please let me know if these terms are acceptable, and I will continue to review. I can accept the invitation or suggest an alternate reviewer. Please note that if I have to do the latter, I will require a $50 fee, since effectively I'm doing your job for you.
That's good.
Right? So I saw that and I'm like, that's perfect. For profit, person's not getting compensated for their time. And this person later on in the thread goes on and talks about how I don't have a problem doing free peer review for journals that are not for profit, right? But when you're making that kind of profit and you're leveraging the workload of people and you're just raking in the cash, right? That is, to me, an ethical issue that we have definitely applies in exercise science journals, because there's too few of us around to go through the 23,000 manuscripts that are gone through peer review this year, 2023. So, then I talked a little bit about peer reviewer two and kind of feedback the person gets. But you're kind of getting, this is another thing I saw on Twitter about reviewer two and the meme of what reviewer two in the comments, right? And so this person like fights back because a lot of the journals are now like not allowing the peer reviewer number two to just hide behind confidentiality. Now they're asking if you want to identify yourself as I reviewed this manuscript. Like you want credit for it, we'll give you the credit for it, right? In recognition for peer reviewing. And so this person took the time to like find who that person was on the manuscript block and like wrote them a letter about how they were critical of their ability to review. So there's a little bit of banter that goes on in the field. Okay. So, we've talked a little bit about expert assessments and the feedback that is positive to be provided to authors of open access and subscription-based papers. But really what it comes down to me is I am always in search of the truth. And I think that's what we all should be doing when it comes to science, is peer review when you have experts that are actually reviewing the paper and are subject content experts in their field. It really helps to build trust, and open access provides an opportunity where when that's done really well, where end users and people who live among our societies can really use that information in real time. You think about how fast some of the COVID-19 papers came out with regards to physical activity and as new information about the virus was coming out. That was quickly getting into the literature within weeks of information coming out from the CDC and the World Health Organization. So when it comes to credibility and trust, it's really important. And people who work in fields where things have gone through rigorous peer review and it's hard to get into a particular journal, when you see science in that, it provides a baseline level of trust in that science that you can go to, right? Think about the New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, American Heart Association, JAMA journals. Very, very hard to get into, but that the criteria to get into those journals is so strong that if you get into those journals, you can really trust that this person definitely has something significant to contribute to the field, okay? So a lot of what you see in terms of the cons of the peer review process, you start seeing that with sort of like the business of Elsevier branching off into all these different journals where now you have people that are people with, master's degrees that don't have PhDs in the content area. Now you can publish absolutely with a master's degree in the field. I know plenty of people from Henry Ford Hospital that are master's prepared clinical exercise physiologists, and they're publishing in top tier journals in medicine, science, and sports and exercise. I'm saying in terms of peer reviewing, oftentimes because there are so many journals in the field now, is the faculty and the people that can peer review just spread too thin. I get asked to probably review at least 2 to 3 a week these days, 2 to 3 a week. And I just can't take all of them on. Now you can argue about whether or not it's ethical to do this, but one of the things that I try to do is if the journal doesn't have particular requirements, is I will like to de-identify the first page of the paper and just the content and use it as an opportunity to teach my students in our clinical exercise physiology lab how to get peer review experience. So they don't know the author's name, but we sit down in lab, we do it as part of like journal club to go through let's show you how to critically appraise an article as a skill set, right? And then of course we synthesize all the information and I use that information collectively as the group leader to synthesize what's relevant, what's not relevant, and put formalized guidelines into my own review. So I don't look at it as definitely not outsourcing because I participate in the whole process with my students. But if the journal doesn't have specific policy guidelines that can't happen, I will use it as a learning moment opportunities to create the next generation of people coming through the field that are knowledgeable and have skill sets in how to do peer review, which I think is an important skill to learn. Okay, a couple other things, right? Peer review also prevents the implication of pseudoscience. So in 2018, I got contacted by the Philadelphia Inquirer about, on Instagram, there was a lot of these for-profit sort of pyramid scheme type things And they wanted to know, like, what I thought about the science of some of these programs, like the scientific rigor of some of these trending programs. And the word, that comes to mind is, how many people have ever, seen these Essentia drinks? And people have seen them, these ionized alkaline waters, right? And people are like, oh, it makes my cells feel better. And if you look at this video, I wonder if we have audio, but I can share the link if people need to. So effectively, there's two bottles here, right? And I'll let it play. So it gives you an idea, right, of some of information or products that are marketed, marketed to the consumers that do not necessarily have to go through full FDA approval. You see this all the time with in the supplement industry, whey protein, creatine supplementation, etc. And this is all, if we go back in time for history, this goes back to in 1994, then President Bill Clinton signed the Dietary Health Supplements and Health and Education Act. And really what was happening is during that time, there was really an explosion of scientific inquiry in terms of medicines and pharmacologics that were coming out. And the FDA just couldn't review all these supplements that were also coming to market. And so what happened is we teach our students the importance of this, because when it comes to supplements and things like alkaline water and all these types of things, it shifts the burden of proof to the consumer as opposed to the FDA or the companies that are responsible. So the FDA really only comes into play if there's an adverse reaction, right? Then they have to pull something off the shelf. But generally speaking, when people go in and they see that water, it can be marketed any way it wants as an alkaline water. And yes, it is alkaline, but effectively, by the time it hits your stomach, it's just like plain old water. So at any rate, that's that. I'm trying to advance the slide here. There we go. Perfect. So a couple of other things. I'm towards the end of the presentation now about the importance of peer review and what it does for open access with accuracy and precision, right? So this is something we teach a lot to our undergrad students in the research methods classes. You can be reliable, but you can't be valid. But if you want to be valid, you got to be reliable, right? Like it's, if you have good quality scientific evidence, it must be consistent. But you could be, for example, consistently late, or and those are like not necessarily desirable effects. So peer review does a really good job for that, in my view. And then in dissemination knowledge, we talked a little bit about implementation science, but a lot of grants and funders now want to know, well, what's your scientific plan after you conduct this study? How are you going to make sure that your work is becoming aware and it's accessible? So typically people have to talk about how they're going to try and shorten that 17 years to routinely increase the systematic uptake of information that is published in scientific works. And so the science of how we go about that and how systems create policies and how policies ultimately change practice is implementation science. But dissemination science is how you get the word out there. Okay. And I feel like nowadays open access does a really good job of that. So, these are a couple of other things that are sort of the cons of the peer review process. We talked a little bit about the rich getting richer type thing, where if you have somebody from a big lab and you're publishing something that is counterproductive to what has been established, sometimes people will tear your work apart, or if they have work that's very similar that's trying to get published into the field, they'll criticize it if they know that they're going to get their paper published in that area so they can be first to market. So that's really important. We talked a little bit about lack of training and how I'm trying to use that to really inform our exercise science and sports medicine students And I think the biggest problem, though, when it comes to peer review is really relevant to there's just not enough people that are willing to do peer review. And so with the number of journals growing exponentially, the quality of the reviews can sometimes suffer. And that means science that maybe should be more tightly regarded and screened and criticized and improved isn't. And so there's a challenge when you get stuff. I always tell my students, I tell people in our lab group that when it comes down to scientific evidence, just because it's published doesn't mean it's good quality, right? And that's a very important thing, I think, to take away. And I think folks generally understand, which is why, we train, as Blair trained me in methodological quality checklists and quality coding and what to look for. Now when I read publications as original research, I find that I'm basically coding them in my brain, right? What were the randomization procedures? Did they have an adequate control? Did they randomize the population? Did they randomize the treatment? All these little things I'm going through like a series of checks and balances when I'm reviewing paper and using that to give a study more or less weight, and really it helps you see in the gray areas of what is feasible and what is good quality and what, might have significant findings, but maybe was sufficiently underpowered with respect to sample size. And so so being able to see those types of things is really what I'm focusing on a lot in the field, and not just sort of having, well, just because it's available means it's good quality. Really understanding that for all the great things that open access does, we still have to review that work with a critical eye, which I think is important. And then lastly, some of the things that are also we have to think about is one of the good things that I think comes out of the open access process is we have digitalization of things. And so, we have to be careful of predatory journals. I got to tell you, Nutrients is a predatory journal. I was special issue when I was on the inside. I'm like, oh, they're just like spamming people for journal articles, and it's all about making those open access charges. And so David and I had to do a lot of work to find people that were willing to write and that also had the funding to pay the open access charges or had support in their structure. So you got to be careful about predatory journals. Nutrients is a good quality predatory journal, but they're definitely the wolf in sheep's clothing. And so you have to be careful about that, because as great of an impact factor as they have, they are definitely for profit. So I talked about digitalization and the importance of, this is kind of like what your typical professor's office may have looked like back in the day. And so a lot of those journal articles now kind of looks like something like this. This is a typical office. It doesn't have a bench in the health sciences building, but you see, we've teched out a lot of the classrooms and the journals are all on the little laptop there. So we have that. And then lastly, the last thing I'll just leave you with, and I'll take some questions, is really about how to find journals. So we talked about using things like journal citation reports, but if you really know your field, look for people that I wouldn't think you should necessarily look for the journal as much. Journals will have reputations. You should really look and see who are the people in your field that you aspire to be like, who are the people that are having good reputations and name brand recognition for the kind of work that they do, and where are the kinds of places that they are publishing. And most of these people, and I will tell you, exercise science is some of the best people professionally where they will tell you the answers to all your questions. So if you're like, I'm looking for, can you read this paper and let me know where a good fit would be? I saw that you published it in Medicine, Science, and Sports and Exercise, but I'm concerned that because they only have 25% acceptance rate right now, that I need to make sure I have a few other options. These folks will gladly not just ignore your email, they will gladly give you 2, 3, 4 options to keep you going. It's a community very much about helping others. So those are some good things, but these are the things that came to mind where, you see papers that are published and how cited they are. Google Scholar's got a lot of good stuff with that. Doing systematic searches through places like PubMed, Web of Science, Scopus, Biosis. These are all great places to find where science is being published in your field. But at the end of the day, you got to really know where your limits are. And I have never been afraid to do that to you, have I, Janice? Is if I have questions and I can't find something, she is always amazing, answers my email promptly, and always addresses the question. If she doesn't know the answer, give me a couple days and I'll find the answer to it. So I thank you all very much for your time and attention. Happy to take any questions you all got from me. Thank you. All right, I think there's something in the chat too. I see a little comment.
That's just from Kathleen, one of our librarians, saying that's one of the first things she tells grad students is to never ever pay for a journal article.
Never pay for a journal article. I learned that lesson early. I was like about to pay for it, and Jill Livingston just goes, "Oh, you're not paying for it. I'll buy it." So, yes, sir.
I really like your example of nature communications,
Nature Communications, yeah.
profit making and all that. But you won't believe so many of faculty members are just passionate about publishing in nature communications.
Right.
Right. And coincidentally, I just had an email from a faculty member yesterday that he wanted to publish his paper in nature communications, but it requires an author processing charge. Guess how much?
Author processing charge,
ABC.
A, B, or C? I'm gonna go with probably 3,000.
Anyone else?
5,000.
Yeah, close. $6,000.
No kidding.
For one article to
Wow.
make it open access from
Yeah,
the
so-
author.
So it's very exclusionary in a lot of ways.
Right. So it's really discouraging many of these researchers to publish in the open access. If these
Yeah.
publishers are going to be keeping on charging so much money for publishing in the open.
I don't know the context of that situation, but here's my thinking on the business side of it, right? Nature has good impact factors. It's a great journal. If you can get one paper published in Nature, it's like your career achievement. But in order to do that, they can't publish a lot of stuff, right? So if they want a lot of citations per unit of paper that gets into those journals, that means that the open access charges or the article processing fees that they do charge has to be significant. So it becomes very much, again, I would look at it as a very exclusive club where that's just not feasible for a lot of people to pay that kind of money. Are these guaranteed to be published, or is it 5,000 just to submit?
It was accepted, he said. The
Yeah.
paper was accepted, but to publish in the open access,
Yeah.
you needed to pay.
Now, I do think there are some journals that are starting to do this where they give you like tokens or credit. Like, I think, like, here's a way where we could bridge the gap, right? Financially with some of this, right? Like, on one hand, colleague definitely wants to get it published in Nature Communications, but the $5,000 is just not possible, right?
Right.
So what's wrong with getting it published and instead of me peer reviewing your work where you're making $5,000, right? And I don't know what goes into the process. I'm sure it's much more involved than I could appreciate. What's wrong with, okay, if I peer review 10 papers and the 5,000 is covered?
Yeah.
Right? I'm giving you a service for the, you're gonna get, let's say 10 papers, now you're making 50,000. I'm peer reviewing $50,000 worth of papers for my $10,000 that you're giving me for my paper, right? And so like, I feel like those type of negotiations should, I think, be had. I don't know how we would go about them, but if people are just like, I'm not gonna be peer reviewing this journal, period, for free when you're making that kind of money on open access charges, at some point, it's gonna, when it hurts their purse, they'll change. The power of the purse, as they call it, right? The power of when it hurts their purse and nobody wants to peer review for them, then they'll change their ways. But the problem is, there's always another generation of people that are coming up that want to make a name for themselves. They think that if I peer review for this journal for free, might increase my likelihood of getting my paper published in there. And there's no real guarantee of that. So it's kind of a moral hazard in a lot of ways. So I hope, did he decide to publish in that journal?
He just sent me thank you after I provided those that we cannot do that.
Yeah.
The libraries.
Yeah,
He sent me the thank you for just thank
I
you.
know. It's too bad because it would have been great to see that in,
I don't know what he's going to do. I have no idea. But maybe he will contact his dean or department chair or whatever.
there's always money. Trust me when I tell you. I mean, I'm not a dean, so I don't know all the specifics, but somewhere in this university, there's $250 here, 1,000 here.
But imagine
It's around.
if there are 10 faculty members who wants to publish in Nature Communications.
Yeah.
$60,000
Right.
just for.
How many, and I wonder how many people they have getting them ready for Nature Communications. 1 or 2 people to pay a salary. And they're also probably cross-trained in a lot of other journals that are in the pipeline.
That is what is puzzling me. The reputation of the journal is high. At the same time, cost of publishing is also very, very high.
Yeah, I don't know a lot in terms of the business of how it works, but I'd be willing to bet that the margins are quite large.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I know you talked about the importance of being creative, getting revenue for APCs, but in your field, just how much money can you get from your grants for this? I mean, are they allotting funding from your grants? For APCs?
It depends on where it's from. Like you can get from smaller funding, like 10, 20, $30,000 worth from like American College of Sports Medicine. They can do stuff like that. They're small, private, nonprofit organization that's largely pulling from their growth and investment accounts for their endowment. And that's how they're able to do that every year to pay for the regional grant program. We've tried in Mid-Atlantic, that's what the Mark ACSM thing was on my profile, to create what's called early stage investigator awards. And it was designed for people that are from, so like one of the challenges is the resources of a big R1 school like Drexel or Penn is, generally the resources are there if you really want it. I mean, 5,000 is a different scenario, but in a smaller school where someone's trying to do research and contribute to the field, like even 1,000 can be like, I don't know where we're going to find that money. So, so we created something called the Early Stage Investigator Award, which is designed for people who are on junior faculty members, first 7 to 8 years of your field before you've gone up for promotion or tenure or both, and to make sure that there is opportunities where the chapter has designated funds to pay for stuff like this. So a lot of the projects are done homegrown with the resources and lab equipment they have. And we give out, $2,000 to $3,000 grants a year. It's not a lot, but it's growing, right? More people, it attracts more people into the chapter that we can grow as we put it into our investment accounts and so forth. So, yeah, in our field though, yeah, a lot of the major grants, like travel and publication fees like that, they generally don't like that, or it's viewed negatively in the grant review process. They're like, we just want to pay you. A lot of foundations, especially, want to pay you for the science.
That's part of it.
I agree.
Right.
I agree, but the minimal amount to like buy your equipment and to if you have to have buyout to run the project, but a lot of times those are the first things to go. If you get a call from the finance office and they say, well, you're like $20,000 over budget, and here's how we're going to be able to balance it for the grant. The first thing that oftentimes goes is like conference travel, which is really important to get the word out there and disseminate, and publication fees. Because the argument is, well, you could just publish it in a subscription-based journal. It's like, okay, well, now you're limiting access, and you're assuming now you're decreasing the pool of resources, right? Like one of the things that I tell ACSM in terms of value, American College of Sports Medicine, I tell them in terms of value. But one of the values of our membership is that you get medicine and science and sports and exercise. And I'm like, yeah, but the way that the structure of it works is it's like, you're not advocating MSSC to the public. The only people that are accessing MSSC are people that are publishing in MSSC, and they're all from academic universities. And I'm willing to bet our subscription here at Drexel can have access to MSSC if we needed it, right? So is it really a value? So we're thinking about things on that end too, about like, how do we increase the value and attract more people to the field in that way? And so understanding that a lot of the people on these, like they're starting to create more open access journals. Like now they have the translational journal of the American College of Sports Medicine, which has open access, right? Whereas medicine, science, sports, and exercise is much more subscription based. And so they are listening, which is important, right? And there's a difference between hearing and listening. And, you could shout all you want, but if they're not listening to you, it doesn't make any difference. But anyway, generally speaking, these are some of the challenges. A lot of grants, it's the first thing to go. Usually it's budgetary issues that hold us back. But yeah, foundations especially want to fund the science, and not that they're cheap, but they might be able to fund a couple projects and use the fixed number of resources that they have for more than one project if they can. So tough game. Other questions, folks?
Just one comment.
Yeah.
when you mentioned the example of nutrients,
Nutrients.
right? And I noticed that it was published by MDPI,
Yes, that they're the
right?
parent
It
company.
captured my attention.
They're Alphabet to Google. Same type of thing.
I know that a couple of months ago, some of their journals were considered as predatory.
Uh-huh.
And I think Web of Science decided to even remove a couple of those journals by indexing them.
Yep.
So I was going to ask that question, but you already mentioned that it was kind of.
Well, one thing that comes to mind about open access journals that are small in scope, like if they get pulled like that, and a colleague, Jen Nasser, of course, she's a good colleague of mine. We talked about this. She had a paper that was published in a predatory journal that went out of business. So not gonna like paper exists, you can't find it. What's the ethics? And I go, I wouldn't necessarily count it as another publication, but one argument would be go publish it somewhere else to get it back on the domain so it shows up in searches. Some would say, well, it's already published, you know, and I'm not here to argue about that. But if nobody could find it, then what's the point? And this is a quote that I'll always remember Laura Gitlin said about some of the work that I was doing, and it really made me put in like designated writing time when I was junior faculty. She's like, yeah, it's great that you have all these experiences, but unless it's published, it doesn't exist. And it's like, that's the currency in terms of getting your work out there. Like, and I took that to heart, you know, and I listened to her. We've published some stuff together, a couple of book chapters. So, yeah, that's a challenge. Like, what happens if one of these predatory journals goes under, they get taken off? What happens in that situation to the science? You might have good quality science. You know, I think you should probably be able to republish it elsewhere. But some people might not think, you know, it's double dipping or it's diluting the field. Yeah.
Slightly related question. When you're publishing open access, how many of these journals, like many of the traditional subscription journals, ask you to sign away a lot of the copyrights to your work as well? Or are they more respectful of?
More respectful from my
you as the
experience. Yeah, they've been pretty respectful. And I haven't run into any issues where like you were the owner of that content. Subscription, they want it all, right? We're publishing our journal, it's ours now. You can put it on your CV, that's our paper now, right? We own it, right? And we can put it on any type of press we want and not tell you about it. Right? If we want to put it on social media, we can do it. And so open access creates an opportunity where people could sort of like with a grassroots type movement really get their word out, and people that like hearing the messaging and the kind of work that you're doing can get that work out. Yeah, I haven't experienced a ton of that where I find that for the most part, it hasn't been an issue. But doesn't mean it can't be an issue, it's just my lived experience. What do you think? I do a good job? Did okay? Thanks. Appreciate you giving me the opportunity. These slides are here, you can share with anybody that wants them to. Okay.